I'm Michael Weinberg. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And I'm going to talk about 10 years of certified open source hardware. What have we learned? I am wearing kind of two hats today. One is I'm the executive director of the Engelberg Center on Innovation, Law, and Policy at NYU Law. If you are in this room because you're kind of open hardware curious, then we have some reports that might be nice entry points. Don't be put off by the fact that it's an academic institution. They're decidedly not academic entry points. So check those out if you are curious. I'm also a longtime board member of OSHWA, the Open Source Hardware Association, which is a community organization for open source hardware. If you don't know OSHWA very well, we do a whole slew of things. If you are probably the most important thing, if you're in this room right now and you were thinking like, I want to get a better sense of open hardware, is we host the Open Hardware Summit every year. This year it is in Edinburgh in May. It's a great fun event, so come on up, I guess, from here in May and check it out. OSHWA also runs the certification program that I'm going to talk about today, Open Hardware Month, monthly show and tell, and also the community definition of open source hardware, which is relevant to the certification. Before talking about what we learned, I will talk a little bit about why the program exists in the first place. And the real reason that we have it is because we had a couple problems emerging in the community about a decade ago. The first problem was sort of tied to the fact that no one owns the term open source hardware. And OSHWA helped develop and is the steward of an Open Gear logo for open hardware, but no one kind of controls that logo in any meaningful way. And as a result, we were getting a kind of misalignment in the community because, as Allison actually mentioned earlier, right, it's hard to kind of quickly check documentation for hardware to see if it's open or it's not. And so we had people who were saying, I have created open source hardware, and we had users who were receiving open source hardware, and the good faith version of this is that they just had different expectations for what that meant. There are also bad faith examples of people just saying this is open source hardware and having no interest in open sourcing it, but setting those aside. So we didn't have a kind of shared understanding in an easy way to know that, you know, if you were saying open source hardware, what specifically you meant. We had a kind of related problem where we had people and organizations and companies who were saying they were interested in open source hardware and they were coming in good faith, but they were worried that if they made some error, the community would sort of get mad at them. And so they were looking for a way to kind of signal their good faith and to work within the community as a kind of first entry point. So we were trying to solve these problems. We had this community definition that OSHWA is the maintainer of, so it was a good kind of shared first step. And we decided to start looking at a certification. And the certification has a new logo that OSHWA actually controls. It's grounded in the definition. So if, you know, OSHWA controlling it is important because if someone is using the logo but not compliant with the definition, then we can say, you have to stop using the logo. So if you see the logo, you know it means something specific. The process allowed us to be an ally to new entrants in the community, right? It was a way, I'll talk about a little bit more, kind of a way in to be working with OSHWA. And also there was sort of limited downside if it didn't work out, right? A certification, if you see a certification and you don't care about it, you just ignore it. And so if it turned out to be a bad idea, it was sort of nothing was lost. But if it turned out to be useful, and it has turned out to be useful, it's a really useful community resource. So we went through about a year-long community process to develop the certification program. I'm happy to talk about the details later, but the upshot was the certification program is free. There are no tiers for certification. It's just you're certified or you're not. There's no kind of like gold open or bronze open. There's no subject area expert reviews. And I'll talk about that, how that works in a little bit later. There's an open hardware expert review, but not a kind of subject area expert review. And it's incredibly lightweight to run, which is important because OSHWA is an organization that punches above its weight, but also is a relatively small organization. And so if it was gonna be a process that was gonna require a dozen full-time people to operate, it wouldn't have made it 10 years. So the process is pretty straightforward. You go to the website, certification.oshawa.org, you apply. The application process can take less than 5 minutes if you have all your documentation together. At that point, it gets reviewed by a team. If everything is great, then you just sort of move on. If there are problems, then the team will reach out to you and say, hey, thank you so much for applying. We noticed your documentation is missing something, or your licensing is missing something. And this has turned out to be a really good way to ease people into the community and to give new people in the community an easy way to learn what the expectations are. Once you get through that process, you get a license to use the certification logo, and you get a unique identifier that everyone can use to find your documentation in the certification directory. The certification directory is a directory. It's not a repository. We don't kind of keep and maintain everyone's documentation. It's just a bunch of pointers so you can find the documentation later. So that's how it works. 10 years in, what have we learned? So first, open source hardware is everywhere. At this point, we're coming up on 3,000 certifications. As you can see, we're all over, including in the UK, where we are right now. 63 different countries on every continent except Antarctica. I always mention that because someday I'm going to be in a room where someone is has a tie to Antarctica and into open hardware, and we're going to cross that off the list. But it really is a kind of global community, which is a really robust strength of the community. And similarly, hardware is incredibly broad, right? We were talking earlier about thinking about boards and silicon, and especially if you're coming from the world of open source software, that may be where you kind of come first. And there are a lot of boards in the certification directory, but it's also much broader than that, right? There are musical instruments, there's camping equipment, there's jewelry, and this is kind of one of the things I really like about the community, which is there's so many entry points into open hardware because hardware is such a capacious category of things. And so this is also, I think, a real strength of the community. In terms of what else has worked, we have this non-expert review community feedback system that has proven to be pretty robust. So as I mentioned earlier, when you get your certification, it's reviewed by someone who's an expert in kind of open hardware, but not a subject area expert, right? They're not necessarily an expert in microcontrollers or jewelry or camping equipment. And so once it gets certified, it's out in the world. And then when a user comes along who is an expert and is trying to make use of your documentation, they might come to Oshawa and say, hey, this documentation is missing something, or it's inadequate in some way. And at that point, Oshawa will find an internal expert to kind of check to see if this is a plausible claim. And if so, we'll reach out to the creator and say, well, we have this user and they have raised this concern. What do you think? And sometimes the creator will say, you're right, we've already fixed it. Great, thank you. Sometimes they'll say, you're right, we're not going to fix it. And if you think it's required, we should just decertify. And sometimes they'll say, you're wrong, it's fine the way it is. And in that third category, Oshawa is in a position to kind of mediate the dispute between the parties, which I think is a better alternative than some of the kind of online forum fights that you see elsewhere, and is a kind of nice way to kind of bring people into the community. Now, sometimes, ultimately, we decide that the creator was right, sometimes the community member was right, sometimes something in the middle, but it's just sort of like negotiated path out. And as a result, documentation has absolutely improved through this process. And also, we have revoked certification, which I view as a real sign of strength for the certification, because it means that it means something, and that when you see it, you know that someone stands behind it, say the definition really matches this hardware. So that's worked pretty well. Another thing that we have learned, a lot of people talk about building a GitHub for hardware because GitHub sort of is not hardware oriented. In practice, GitHub is GitHub for hardware. These numbers are kind of a quick and dirty pull. I wouldn't take these to the bank, but this is basically directionally correct. But the tail is really long on this. Because people host, as you can imagine, with the diversity, both geographic diversity and subject area diversity, the kinds of documentation people have is incredibly broad, and the places they host it is incredibly broad. But GitHub is GitHub for hardware. Another thing that we have about the certification is that because it allows people to kind of offload verification of openness, we've talked over the years about how it can be a kind of building block for other things. And that's worked okay. Hardware X is an academic journal that's focused on open hardware. They say, hey, if you have an OSHWA certification, we'll assume you're open hardware. We won't spend a lot of time examining it ourselves. They've sort of offloaded that process to us. We've worked with the DIN spec here in the EU, not here in the EU. Thanks, Brexit. They've also used it. OSHWA is also using it ourselves. We've just kicked off a process to do open medical devices. And we're looking at using the certification as kind of a step one, where first you certify the medical device as open hardware, and then there's a second layer that focuses on medical hardware specific elements. And by breaking those things up, we kind of atomize them a little bit and make it a little bit cleaner. So that process has worked-ish. I don't have like 40 logos up on this slide, but I think that it works conceptually. We have citations built into the directory where people can show what hardware they're building off of. People use it sometimes for their own hardware, sometimes for others. That works. That's also in the kind of works-ish category. People definitely use it, but I wouldn't say that the majority of entries in the directory are making use of it today. A thing that is sort of, it works, but we don't use it very much is we have a read-write API. So you can use the read side of the API to kind of learn everything about the certification directory. The map that I had, the GitHub for hardware slide, that was all used, kind of pulling data out of the API. It's also a write API. So if you wanted to kind of build automation of submitting applications into your workflow, you can do that. People do that. People use both sides of the API, but it's not kind of like, it's not lighting the world on fire. It's not as popular as we thought it was going to be when we put it together. So that's sort of it. That's how the certification works. If you're interested, certification.oshwa.org. Thank you everyone who had the images for us using in this talk. If you have questions, obviously I look a lot like this. You can find me, and email and Blue Sky is where I'm mostly at these days. But social media is a dynamic place, so who knows where that will be tomorrow. So thank you so much. I know, time for questions.
Great.
Maybe?
Thank you, Michael. We have a question over here.
I think I'm becoming the honorary question asker, but is there thoughts at the moment on how certification applies to open source silicon? Open source semiconductor?
Yeah, I think the kind of high level, the short answer is yes. And on some level, it's like, it applies like anything else. We actually went through an exploratory process for FGPAs 3 or 4 years ago. And so I think it can work, and we are waiting, we're talking to people and we're waiting for someone to come and say, I want to certify the silicon, and there's a problem with this process that I can't just do it. Because my hope is that it works at a high enough level of abstraction that the process will work. But the question is always, what is adequate documentation for this space? And that is something that I think we will need to wait for someone who says they want to go through the process with us.
Yeah, because one of the issues there, of course, is like you're almost certainly going to be using a manufacturing process that's proprietary. Which is fine, right? Because one of the kind of intellectual structures around the certification is the user contribution. Because so much of hardware is proprietary, right? Like no one has like open LEDs or whatever it is. And so the idea is you have to make open what you contributed to the hardware and what you have the legal right to make open. Sense.
And the kind of corollary to that is everything else has to be generally available. If you have to sign an NDA to access it or something like that, then it probably won't be certified.
That's the problem you face with semiconductor processes, right?
And so this is where the kind of rubber meets the road.
Not only just have signed an NDA, you're like, it can take years to sign an NDA.
Yeah. Right. And so if the question is, if it's like you have to go through this process that is not generally available to whoever, obviously there are many barriers to availability, but if it's not generally available to someone who was properly motivated to do it, then that can be a problem. If sort of anyone can come in and sign that NDA, we would be interested in exploring it.
Yeah, actually, that might be, we can talk about this offline.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kind of related, I think. Can you certify components of an overall thing? Because you can't necessarily do all the rest of it.
Yeah. This is a great question. Basically, what the rule is you have to certify at a kind of level of completeness, so the thing can work the way it is expected. And what that means for any kind of specific piece of hardware is going to be different. But one easy rule of thumb, especially if it's a commercial product, is if it's sold as a kind of SKU, then that's the level that you should be certifying at. If it's merely a component of something that is larger, especially if you're creating the larger piece, you can't pull something out, certify the incomplete sub-assembly, especially you can't do that and then say the entire thing is certified open hardware.
So, but if you, in this case, I'm thinking of a motherboard, backplane, et cetera, if all of that is sold separately.
Totally. Yeah.
Even though the whole also goes into a case that you can't open source.
Exactly.
You could certify those components.
That's a great example. So like a motherboard, which is something that obviously you could buy a laptop, but if the motherboard is kind of available as a standalone piece, you can totally certify it, and you can talk about how the laptop or the computer has certified open hardware as long as you're clear that the laptop isn't certified, but the piece is.
I see. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hi. Just to distinguish, I'm going to ask about licenses. I'm not asking about your license.
This is my love language.
Yeah, it's where I work as well. I'm not talking about your trademark license, but the license between like developers and the world. So do you have restrictions on the licenses that those guys should be using?
Yes. So there's a whole section of the website that talks about different licenses. The kind of short version is that there's a broad range of licenses that meet the definition and meet the requirements. Most standard open source licenses, people use Creative Commons licenses. Andrew Katz was going to talk about CERN's great open hardware licenses. And so there are licenses that tend to cluster, the community tends to cluster around, but we will take hardware that uses any license that complies with the open hardware definition. So it's a broad understanding of what those licenses are.
But you don't find that that's cumbersome when someone homebrews a license?
It happens rarely enough that it's not overly cumbersome. What I have found is that because it's easy in the directory to see what other people use, and in the application, there's a drop-down that basically is sort of as a list of preferred licenses and then other. People tend to, the universe of people who are interested in enrolling their own license when faced with the option of a drop-down is relatively narrow, and like I'm happy to have that conversation. As someone who has rolled my own license, I'm happy to have that conversation with them, but we're not inundated with sort of random licenses that feel legally shaky.
Thank you.
Yeah. If that happens, I will eat my words.
Any further questions?
Cool.
Great. Let's bring that. So thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you, everybody. Have some lunch.